Hello, all fine small group of subscribers to this channel, for which I believe I can mention them all by name. It is without compromise that I am irreducible to the totality of the efforts of planet Earth now to become of something that resonates within the idea itself as something that finds its place in all domains of consciousness and in society and in the economy as such. Now, I want to differentiate between the social consciousness, the economic consciousness, the political consciousness, and then the ethical and aesthetic consciousness, and also the subcategories there too that have to do with literature, the arts, science, if one wishes to include the entertainment industry in this, it's up to them to concern themselves with that. But I would say, rather than conclusively appeal to the idea that entertainment is a resource, is an escape from contact, the points of contact with the actual activities that are going on upon the planet, it always strikes me as extremely wrong to prioritize pure entertainment. Now, I'm at an age where this is perhaps a normative experience for people to have, individuals to have. But I'm not necessarily an individual insofar as when I use language, I am using a word, for instance, that can be signified to other people as something that is broader than the scope of my own individual powers of perception. So if I were to acknowledge recent events that had happened in Paris, or I were to look at electoral situations, the electorate of perhaps something that has now become a template for Canadian society and politics, is where the coordinates of how we are situated within ourselves as almost as entities that are willing to combine in some sort of either fictitious or fragmented way, trying to create some sense of unity. And it seems to me that multiplicity and multicultural society tend to divide something in the subject between its own individuality and the idea of the group or the whole or the completion of themselves. And I want to look at the possibility of gathering some sort of sense of perhaps not a unification of that multiplicity or the multicultural ideas, the ideas of an other, in what I consider to be a symbolic dimension of understanding the consciousness and the intellect as something resolutely not denied access to discourse as such, as a way of expressing human values and participation in a larger social and political context than it possibly might have done in the past. That things would be so permissive as to acknowledge the notion that participation would possibly be at the level of individuality, that an individual would say, this is my sort of point the finger and say, this is my claim or my perhaps request for the more diplomatic members of discursive activity. We can look at that as sort of an observance of ritual, in a sense, that has to do with the signifiers and those symbols that had resided in theocratic, that had for them theocratic origins. But certainly, since we have based the context for which we resonate as species, as a species that is still identifying itself as such, it's still redescribing its place of origin in a way. Similarly, in the 19th century, with Charles Darwin and Karl Marx, sort of cohorts in the sort of design of how science would move forward toward the realization of how society would be formed and how governments would create, eventually in the 20th century, would create a position with which we all had to identify or fought or tried to escape or were sent into exile for having inhabited as someone that was not in collusion with the powers that opposed them, the very powers that opposed them. The idea of compliance to that, the source of the collusion is, once one sees that, one sees the symbolic dimension as something different to the origins of what had totalized man and humankind, man, woman, humankind, all forms of being into their varying signifiers, all significations possible of said multiplicity or multiculturalism, all ethical or ethnic or within the dominion of what designs the symbolic experience of transcending from the point where one is just simply sitting in a chair and attempting to position oneself in a room amidst a series of objects all situated there. And when you speak to, for instance, at the level of something such as something that eventuates in the possibility of a entertaining experience, such as film, the objects are all situated in the space, but they're part of the manifold experience of what determines the space as an open space to the possibility of some event taking place in connection to those objects. So that is the reason why there's not much difference between the way objects are situated in a empty space where there is nothing really happening, and the world itself, where there are all sorts of objects situated, or structures, architecture, things of this nature, situated in a space where something could happen that had to do with the individual will of one person, and such as are accidents or such as are determinations. And to call them either determinations or accidents is another aspect of the human psyche. And to resolve to the conclusion that we say there is no determinability to a mathematically possible event happening is to say that we would find ourselves innocent of actually acting as the cause to the event that had occurred as a collective sort of world society that has not really realized itself in any sort of economic, manifold, a global economic manifold of cooperative entities all conferring on the same possibilities that was somehow universalized into this concept of how we would would identify the possibilities themselves and give them their particular coordinates and describe them and ascribe to them all the possibilities and be able to collectively or very singularly determine an outcome, such as is the case for subjects that are looking for a situation where you can find yourself out of the aporia or the problematic judgments of consciousness so as to resolve into a situation where you are perfectly safely coordinated into a very secure position in society. And originally, humankind had thought that this would be most possible when the idea of casting a vote, for instance, is the ability to do so, is the ability to secure one's own identity and one's own the facets, the aspects, and the determinations that are possible of what will become of an outcome for a subject or a collective or a city-state or a province or a state or a nation-state or the planet, as it were. But we can see how here, what I'm trying to interpret, hermeneutically interpret, is the relationship between a place of symbolic historical origin and then the symbolic historical origins of a certain space of reality that has the potency to create certain events that just naturally develop through time into what forms the consciousness of a particular content to subjectivity, a subject with a particular content that is being modulated by this historical development. Said historical development is modulating their own subjectivity and is arriving toward the possibility of an event taking place. And the word I've fashioned to describe this principle is Eventism. Eventism is largely based upon the notion that the qualities of a subject are intrinsic to them, just as the natural properties of Earth are intrinsic to Earth. All the species that exist upon the Earth are naturally existing. And then the interactions and the intersections between society and nature, between human beings, the intersections where identities are in a state of conflict, has something to do with what is causal to the particularity of an individual that is merely trying to create themselves as a singular or recreate themselves as a singular being and project themselves as identical to themselves as they have chosen to design themselves. So the idea of imposing some sort of overarching body politic to superimpose a state of affairs is never going to function properly, and one will always be toiling with the interstices where the gathering of opportunities, possibilities or impossibilities are all in a state of flux. Just as the very singular choice to do one thing or the other that results in either an accident or something very successful taking place and something, what is that, the source of the triumph, a sense of triumph over an obstacle. So what I'm positing at this point, what I'm trying to use, I'm attempting to use logos to not to introject a viewer with the idea that they could perceive themselves as anything less than what they are, but suggest that the dynamics that determine the subjective experience are influenced by all these contained compartmentalizations of society that sometimes perhaps will upset certain people into wanting to just simply submit to the idea of unification. And I resisted the idea of pure unification, but I thought that inner unity was, I posited that inner unity was fine if the outer realm was determined by the particular dimension. And for in this case, the illumined being is most notably contained within the idea that their relation to the other can be entirely symbolic and total in some sense of from where the origins of the reason they had a representation, a symbolic representation within mind, that would conclude in a reasonable event, or perhaps something quite dialectical that was very convincing of the idea that abstraction was possible in order to reproduce a subjective experience that had for its logos as the source, part of the discourse of community activity and designed the landscape, the empirical landscape as well is not always, I will have to say, that is not entirely coordinated with the interior space. The external landscape is quite different, but if one can just simply situate the objects where they are in the space, and then situate subjects within those, and design something that is somehow externally, not in a state of conflict, but in a position of discourse and discussion, and not just simply the idea of agreement or disagreement. And then the inner space can be part of the symbolic dimension, and that is recourse to the idea that the source of this was really for all the philosophers was quite based in theology, and it was brought into philosophy as a way of sort of broadening the social landscape and development that became eventuated into a scientific developments. And the idea that science can progress, but not just progress to the degree that it is shown to be just a discrete science that is looking for funding and looking to develop something very, very particular to a certain practice. That's quite important. But where ontology and science meet is the place where things can happen so as to make the interior space and the empirical, the outer inner space, more equally scientific, and the interior space more symbolic, and part of the illumination, the self-realization of nature and society as a relationship or relations between the coordinates of possibilities that are engaging two subjects as real people and not just simply fictitious designed entities, which is child play, really. But should this event occur, we will certainly observe it. I've not seen a child at play inside my mind younger than 30 years of age. But I will say that absolutely the other dimension of the symbolic realm is the social imaginary, and playing games within the mind that result in where they influence the idea of economic development is where I have an issue. I take issue with playing the use of the imagination to garner favor to garner economic advantage. But simply put, being human is such that if one is to impose a limitation upon the imagination such that it is only willing to win or succeed in terms of economic advantage, is this put into all the aforementioned of the multiplicity and the multiculturalism of varying identities ontologically constituted in the symbolic dimension becomes a problem. So there has to be some form of unity that does exist. I mean, it's a category, Kantian category of consciousness, and we have, I will say that totality is another category, and plurality as well. And we can certainly say that if we could take a modality to this as a way of doing what Kant had done, it would certainly be possible to develop society in a new way, as it been offered by him through very lengthy periods of contemplation. Immanuel Kant, 1724 to 1804, and this piece was not simply about Kant. It was about the social developments that result from the symbolic dimension. Thank you.